welcome panelists to today's discussion on the future of green growth in Africa. I'd also like to recognize on the floor we have two people who will be making contributions to this discussion. Mr. Dominic O'Neill, I believe he's here. Dominic, if you could just stand up so we could see you. There we go, in beige, who's the ED representing, Executive Director, that is, representing the United Kingdom, Italy, and Netherlands at the African Development Bank. And Mr. Landry Ndikrico Mayigane. Please stand. Thank you so much. President of the Youth Alliance for Climate Action in Rwanda. Looking forward to those perspectives. But firstly, let's define what we mean when we talk about green growth very briefly. Green growth is a selection of economic activities that promote environmental change for social development that does not harm the environment or human welfare. Green growth improves water, energy and food security. It promotes sustainable use of a country's natural resources. Priorities in reaching green growth include building resilience to climate shocks, providing sustainable infrastructure, creating ecosystem services, and making efficient and sustainable use of natural resources, and also some many other things, that our panelists will be talking about. Green growth must consist of job creation or economic growth that is driven by reduced emissions, improved efficiencies in the use of natural resources and the protection of ecosystems. Green growth will contribute towards poverty eradication, sustained economic growth, enhanced social inclusion, improved human welfare with opportunities for employment, while at the same time maintaining the healthy functioning of the Earth's ecosystems. And on that note, I want to introduce and welcome a keynote speech from the Honourable Minister from Rwanda, Mr. Kamanzi. Please, if you could just come to the podium. Thank you. A round of applause, please.
Distinguished panelists, august audience, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted and honored to extend to you a warm welcome to Rwanda on the occasion of the 2014 FDB annual meetings. And I also thank you for turning up as we reflect on a very critical and exciting theme, green growth, the future for Africa. The move to embrace green growth has been tremendous across Africa around the first 5 years. Many African countries have indeed developed and generated their national green growth strategies. To harness the much-needed synergies, the same was done at continental and within regional groupings. While the green growth appeal has been undeniably high, translation into real action remains fundamentally challenging and problematic. Africa's economic growth is on the rise, which is very good news. It is, however, noteworthy that the enablers of that positive economic transformation intrinsically contradict with the green growth tenets and dynamics. The current growth registered in Africa is mainly based on intense extractive industry involving minerals, oil, timber, and fisheries, based also on the agriculture sector that is sustained by increased use of chemical fertilizers. The carbon footprint of power generation remains very high in many African countries that invariably use coal and oil. This state of affairs exposes Africa to perpetual global market shocks in commodity prices on both the supply and demand ends, and it may sooner or later compromise the sustainability of the current economic gains. Marking a transition towards a different growth pathway stands therefore imperative if our nations are to maintain and accelerate the current growth pace. The very able panel before you this morning was set to facilitate a reflection on how best Africa can tap the opportunities inherent to the green approach to economic development to back up the current positive growth trend and to build sustainable systems that are well integrated and competitive within global settings. We expect the panelists to share with us insights and success stories from African countries that have embarked on targeted, ambitious, and pragmatic green growth programs that have enabled set-up grants for medium and long-term systemic developmental transformation. For Rwanda, we were able to develop our national strategy for climate change and low carbon development in 2011. Its threefold purpose includes guiding the national policy and planning in an integrated fashion, mainstreaming climate change into all sectors of the economy, and positioning Rwanda to access international funding to achieve climate resilience and low carbon development. It addresses how we should overcome the major hitches to Rwanda's sustainable development that include demographic pressure and climate vulnerability relevant to high dependence on rain-fed agriculture, dominant hydropower accounting for more than half of our electricity generation, intense use of fossil fuels affected by price volatility, and finally, costly air and land international connections. Its making coincided with the completion year of the first generation of our economic development and poverty development strategy, EDPRS-1, and the commencement of consultations on its second generation, the EDPRS-2. This afforded an opportunity to mainstream green growth in this medium-term planning framework, whereby one of the major priorities set is relevant to pursuing a green economy approach to economic transformation. Aiming at green growth patterns is not optional, but a desirable pathway to embark on. The ultimate objective is to transform Rwanda by 2050 into a developed country with a strong services sector where industry and agriculture have a minimal impact on the environment and are hinged on resource use efficiency, operating in a sustainable way. Development is envisaged to be achieved with low carbon domestic energy resources and practices, ensuring community livelihoods, resilience to climate vulnerability. To support the implementation of that strategy, we have already set up a national fund for the environment and climate change called FONERWA, which is the channel to mobilize national and international financial resources to fund projects and other initiatives that support the green growth national agenda. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, green growth for Africa is vital. Its implementation is critical to sustain the present economic growth. It may come at a big upfront cost, but the dividends down the road are even much higher. There are sectors where quick wins can be achieved at national level, but at continental level as well. In that regard, I want to leave you with a teaser about how, for instance, tapping the Inga hydropower resources may bring about an unprecedented shift in providing a very big part of Africa with clean, affordable, and renewable energy, while cutting down the ever-increasing carbon footprint in power generation characteristic of our continent. I thank you very much for your kind attention and wish you fruitful discussions.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Kamanzi, for that keynote speech and shedding some light on where Rwanda stands on green growth. I want to focus on two other country perspectives, Richard Conte and Trevor Manuel. Questions for you. Is transitioning towards green growth crucial for your countries, and what does it actually mean in real terms? Mr. Conte, if you could start for us, Chief of Staff, Office of the President, Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much. Green growth for us in Sierra Leone actually means much, and it helps us really transition from the current trends we are taking and to ensure that we don't deplete our environment beyond recognition, as I would say. For us, it means developing our infrastructure, our energy, our cities in a sustainable manner, managing our resources, both natural, renewable, and non-renewable, in an efficient way, and building the resilience that we need to benefit our own people. In doing this, however, we believe that it has to be inclusive, it must add value, it must ensure that our women and youth are included, it must be linked to our national programs and priorities, it must ensure that there are partnerships between our local entrepreneurs and international entrepreneurs, it must bring on board local content considerations, it must create jobs, and it must strengthen governance and ensure that the revenue, we can reverse the current environmental degradation trends. However, in doing this, we do acknowledge that there are challenges. We do note that the high cost of bringing in the new technologies is there. Sometimes they are not even available. Sometimes the capacity does not exist. And sometimes even we have to deal with this debate that has existed between the developmentalists and environmentalists over what comes first. Do we go for environmental considerations at the expense of development, or do we do the two in a balanced way? We have to ensure that in doing this, we deal with the issue of our weak policy and social arrangements, including our weak governance structures, because if we don't do that, then there is no way we can move forward. So we therefore have to engage with our policymakers, engage with our governments to win necessary support, put in place necessary policies and incentives to steer this process, ensure that our national budgets are streamlined and programmed to suit that, and ensure that the private sector is an integral part of this, taking everybody along and ensuring that we can deliver what is needed, not only for this generation, but for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conte. Trevor Manuel, South Africa, Green Economy.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Good morning to all of you. It's very important that we frame the question correctly, and I want to start from the premise that the major transition we have to undertake is not an optional issue. The carbon economy has kind of run its course. We need an entirely new paradigm. Hopefully the summit convened by the UN Secretary General on the 23rd of September this year can begin to transition, but we must be very clear about understanding that it's a major paradigm shift. It's not continuing as we were before with a little solar panel on the roof. It's about changing all of the interrelationships, and because of that reason, it's fundamentally about power. It's about the political economy, and yes, there will be upfront costs, but I think we must recognize that part of the problem now is a problem of generations of people who've emitted carbon and created the problem. So, in the spirit of equal but differential responsibilities, we must ensure that the financing is available and that the program is driven. In South Africa, the moves towards especially solar and wind as part of our renewable commitments are very impressive, but not enough, because, I mean, as a country, we emit very high CO2 per unit of GDP. That's been the development path of our country. It's like riding a tiger. It's exceedingly difficult. It's easier to mount than to dismount. And that's a South African story. It's a big challenge for us. But I think we look at this issue not as a nation state alone, but understanding that this is perhaps the biggest challenge of our generation. And unless we can mobilize adequate support and deal with the issues of power in the context of political economy, everything else is tinkering at the edges. Grant Inga, it's not a single country that can afford to invest in that kind of infrastructure. We've got to look at this as Africans together and drive a hard bargain. But I think that those other states in the world must be part of this. And I think that the 23rd of September summit is an opportunity that we shouldn't waste, because there have been other opportunities. Heads of state convened in Copenhagen and committed to $100 billion a year, and we faffed around that issue. We must ensure that we can drive a harder bargain now. Thank you.
Trevor, you say the carbon economy has run its course. Many people don't believe that, and many people feel the green growth agenda will slow down development in Africa. So I'd like to come to VP for Sector Operations for the African Development Bank. maybe you can point out to us, sir, what are the consequences of not transitioning towards green growth? Can Africa afford to follow the same path, the same growth pathway as industrialized nations, and then worry about green growth later?
Well, this is really a good question, and the straight answer to your question is no, and let me explain why. If you look at where we are today, Africa is in a completely different landscape compared to where we were 5 years ago. In the run in preparation for Rio+20, there was a lot of anxiety among African ministers, African development ministers, finance ministers about what will this mean for Africa and whether this would in fact limit Africa's capacity to grow. And I think African Union, ECA, UNEP, African Bank, and many others have worked collectively to try and raise awareness and make sure that everyone, especially policy and decision makers, understand it's not about limiting growth. It's about growth, but in a different way. And I think it was quite an achievement actually for Africa to go to Rio+20 with one voice on a common position at what Africa's understanding of green development is. And I think some of the outcomes that came from Rio+20, in particular in this whole area of energy and fossil fuel and all of these things, were quite favorable because it recognized Africa's right to grow and develop its economy using different mixes of sources, natural resources that are available to different countries. From where we sit in the African Development Bank, we work with a variety of countries, and we have seen really a very strong political will with many of the African countries taking strong leadership. South Africa is a great example. Sierra Leone, Kenya, Mozambique, of course, Ethiopia is one of the very, very leading examples. And all of these examples actually seek to develop their economies, but recognizing that they need to do it differently. And the greatest contribution we bring in the African Development Bank is to help those countries with the upstream analytical work to define what the options are for each country, because Ethiopia does not necessarily need to develop the same way South Africa is, and I can elaborate later on in the discussion on some of these examples. But the quick answer to your question is no, and this is how I see it.
Great. And talking about the consequences for not transitioning towards green growth, I'd like to throw this question to everybody on the panel. What are those consequences? Because so many people are still not buying into green growth. It does have an image problem. Perhaps I can come to you, Desta, from UNEP.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Perhaps, first of all, I'm very happy to be here with the distinguished panelists on behalf of United Nations Environment Programme, and would like to thank FDB for the invitation. Just to add on what Honorable Minister from South Africa, Trevor Manuel, said, there are global and regional fundamental drivers that are pushing the issue of green economy, green growth into development discourse. This is not a creation of a group of experts or institutions. And this change will affect every country across the globe. So it's a global agenda. This is a moment of social transformation at the scale of perhaps agricultural revolution and industrial revolution. So leaving behind, not being engaged in this process, particularly for African countries. African countries have the greatest challenge, the greatest opportunity in terms of leapfrogging to green economy, green growth, compared to any of the other regions, considering their natural resource base, considering their the latest starter coming into the global development domain, building their economies, becoming the next frontier of growth and foreign direct investment for the global economy. This is the moment for African countries to catch the opportunity. If any country is not prepared to take benefit of this opportunity, they will be affecting their people and their development agenda. And just one point, in Africa currently, the countries that are taking the leadership role in promoting green economy, green growth, are amongst the fastest growing economies. Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, Mozambique. These are the fastest growing economies in Africa, but they are also looking into the future, 20, 25 years down the line, and preparing their country for long-term development. So not taking action now is being left behind and paying a big price, especially for the population of the region.
Are there any countries not buying into green growth?
Well, there are a number of African countries. I wouldn't say not buying as such, but this is changing trajectory of development is always a challenging task, not only for a country, even in a family. To change the trajectory of your family management is a challenging task. So it requires a lot of effort and understanding and leadership and being prepared to take the risk. So some countries are still reluctant, but right now we, together with African Development Bank, UNECA, UNDP, we are struggling to respond to the request that is coming from African countries to be supported, to be on this track. So that the number of countries that are adopting green economy, green growth, or trying to work along that line is increasing day by day.
Well, that's good news. You talk about fostering understanding, and that's something that your organization focuses on, Monsieur Henri Bernard from OECD. What are the challenges and opportunities in mainstreaming green growth? What is needed to make green growth attractive to decision makers in Africa, and how can it be promoted by an organization like your own and maybe others?
Well, I think it's primarily a change of mindset that's required. I was born in the 60s, and in those days, you were learning economics as being mostly capital, labor, and intangibles like innovation. Natural capital wasn't part of the equation. So I guess it's going to be easier for the next generations. For ours, it requires a real revolution, of how we look at economics. The whole challenge is to look at economics through greener lens, if you will. And it requires that we consider this natural capital as fulfilling two different purposes. One is an input into economic growth, and countries like South Africa, like many others, still have a very strong comparative advantage in natural resources. It's been associated very much with the whole literature on the natural resource curse. We tend to believe that there's more of a bad policy curse than a natural resource curse. There are many examples of countries who have used their natural resources not just to grow, but actually to develop, to transform and diversify. So I think these are the examples that should be emulated. But that should be reconciled with the other purpose, which is, of course, to continue and preserve the sort of services that the natural capital provide for our lives. Air we can breathe, water we can drink, and the whole challenge for us, and again, especially our generation, is to reconcile these two. The final thing is also to realize that the markets alone are not going to solve the problem. Valuing natural capital is still a huge challenge for us all, and that does require smart public action to make sure that it is properly valued and that the incentives are put in place to encourage both public and private actors to protect the capital and manage it wisely. One thing that people sort of underestimate is how much natural resources, energy, minerals, agriculture, of course, last but not least, in Africa tend to be underexploited rather than overexploited. And that's mostly because there hasn't been enough investment in exploring those resources. On average, I think the continent spends about $5 per square kilometer in exploring for its natural resources, when in most emerging countries or OECD countries, this would be like $50, $60, $65. So as a result, the share of discovered mineral resources in Africa over the last decade actually was halved compared to what it was 10 years ago. And I think the first thing is to value properly, first, the stock of natural capital that's in countries, and secondly, its price, its value for societies, for individuals. One way we can contribute together is to provide the tools for policymakers to make better informed choices. The OECD has been working for more than 10 years now with the African Development Bank, producing our African Economic Outlook. That's the way we look at economies. And the way we look at economies is to say GDP has grown by X%. GDP per capita has grown by X%. whenever we did try to mainstream the analysis, of what governments do to protect the environment, to promote a greener type of growth, in the country notes that the country economists of the bank are drafting every year. But I think we should go further. And maybe by working together, we can make sure that the model that we use to account for economic performance includes a proper valuation of this natural capital. I think that would be a way where we could actually provide the background, at least for policymakers to promote a greener growth agenda.
Thank you, Henri Bernard. I'd like to go back to Minister Kamanzi and Mr. Conte and yourself, Trevor Manuel. We talked about how to make green growth attractive to decision makers, but what about ordinary people who are the drivers of the economy? How do you explain to them what green growth is, and how have you in your individual countries tried to make it more attractive to them?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, the transformation we're talking about is meant for those ordinary people, meaning the general public, but also those, the actors in terms of investment, in terms of community management, and so on and so forth. So it's critical that from the start, they act concomitantly with the decision makers. Now, the decision makers, of course, have to ensure that they are put in place the right framework in terms of proper policies, refined policies, the strategies like those we talked about. You need a clear strategy that can be easily implementable, and at the same time, providing all incentives that are needed in terms of human resources. We're talking here about a new concept. It's a new concept that needs to be properly understood. I would confess that even at decision-making levels, we're not able to capture it properly. So we need to work on that and to ensure that it percolates downstream, so that everyone understands it, understands the benefits inherent to it. So I think, in short, those are things that need to be done to get the overall public to embark on the campaign, if I may say.
Excellent. Mr. Conte, explaining green growth to the ordinary citizens and getting them to buy in to it, what are you doing, and is it possible to do it effectively?
In my earlier submission, I did state that there is this big debate over development versus the environment. There is clearly the need for development. There's clearly the need for infrastructural development. There's clearly the need to grow our economies. What Green Growth seeks to do is to make sure that we do this in a sustainable way, in an efficient way. For the average Sierra Leonean, you need to face the current realities of what we see in our everyday happenings. In Sierra Leone, for example, we see that even the weather patterns have become very erratic. We've seen what the effect of housing, construction all over the place is causing even on our scenery. We have seen what the effect of firewood harvesting for domestic consumption is having on the environment. The greens are disappearing. So if we want to move into the future, if we talk about green growth, about developing our economies in a sustainable manner, about introducing new technologies, about ensuring that businesses grow to be able to stimulate the necessary economic growth that the country needs, then we need to get down and get our people to actually understand what the implications of doing business as usual would be. And that would mean that we will degrade our environments, we will have a situation wherein the future is seriously compromised. So what we are now doing in Sierra Leone is to ensure that we mainstream green growth into the agenda for prosperity. In every pillar of the agenda for prosperity, starting from economic diversification to issues around human development, to issues around even social inclusion, issues around gender, we make sure that we mainstream green growth, that people understand that in everything that we do, we have to do it in such a way that we develop while at the same time not jeopardizing the future for our people.
Thank you, Mr. Conte. Let me just very quickly acknowledge the presence of our dear President Kaberuka. Thank you so much for coming. A round of applause for President Kaberuka, who's joined our session, and perhaps we'll pose an impromptu question to you very soon. Trevor Manuel, I was asking about touching the lives of ordinary people and getting your average South African to buy into this.
You know, Yvonne, let's just look outside of the continent for a moment. 12 years ago, everybody was very enthusiastic. China was commissioning one thermal coal-fired power station a week. You know, countries with copper were very happy because the demand seemed inevitable. As China approaches the summer season again, you will see that it's impossible for Chinese people to breathe. And so the government in Beijing understands very clearly that shifting from that to a green economy is not an optional issue. And I think in many ways it's a leading edge of shifts in the world. You've had other parts of the world, the shift from Indonesia through Malaysia and Singapore of smoke from fires. You've had it in the US, in Washington late last year. The same kind of issue will recur in different environments. So we must understand that this is a moment for us to think differently and to drive a different bargain. That's a challenge of leadership right now. But it is a systemic change. You see, Henri Barnard was raising a very important point. But I think it's necessary for us to understand that the tools that economists use, GDP is a construct, it's a very recent construct, but it's about output, not about measuring damage. And so part of what we need to be pushing at together as progressives is to rethink how things get measured, and GDP is actually a measurement of nothing. So it's a tough, provocative point I'm raising, but part of our thinking about this, and the other point to raise as well, is that all of the changes, both in technology and in interconnectedness across the world, are continuous. They're not going to pause and hope for change. And so the point that Ali raised earlier about the fact that we have to do this against the existing knowledge base that all of us possess. We've grown up in a different environment, and this is what makes the challenge so exciting, so hard, but so necessary. And so whether we speak to people on the ground in Sierra Leone, or we do it right here in Rwanda, or in South Africa, or in Shanghai, wherever we do it, I think that it is a generational and a paradigm shift that we're talking about. And the urgency of this matter is something that we must really take account of. Thanks.
Please come in, Desta.
Just a short addition to the question you raised. In fact, the challenge that we have is more convincing the educated elite rather than the ordinary people. I mean, the moment we go to communities and talk about ecosystem-based adaptation and food security, automatically the communities understand what it means for their livelihood, for their well-being. So the ordinary people, waste to resource conversion. Across Africa, a number of youth groups are organizing themselves to convert the waste that the domestic centers or the urban centers are producing into useful products. This is happening. So we don't have a problem with the ordinary people as far as we make it contextualized and real to their life. Not the expert talk, but the real practical engagement with the ordinary person.
Excellent. If we say the facts are there, the argument is one, countries are buying into it. A pertinent question, I think, is where will the financing for green growth come from? And President Kaberuka, I hope you don't mind an impromptu question, an invitation to the podium as president of the ADB to come and answer that question for us. Where will the financing for green growth come from? Please come up to the podium. A round of applause for President Kaberuka, please.
Thank you, and good morning. You know, Yvonne, there's a man here on this panel who could have answered that question several times over. He's a South African, and he's sitting number 2 there. Because he worked on these issues for a long time. So before answering the question, let me thank the panelists for joining us today to share with us your thoughts on this very important subject, which are the heart of what the African Development Bank wants to do. Let me say 3 things on this green growth thing. When the Europeans were industrializing and the Americans soon thereafter, they did so on the basis of coal. When the Koreans began the industrialization process, they did so on the basis of oil, very cheap oil. Very cheap oil. And when 30 years ago China began its path to industrialization, oil was still very cheap, less than $20 a barrel. As we seek to industrialize, oil is above $100 per barrel. So as Meles now used to say, there's even the basic fact, we cannot afford that path to industrialization. It's a simple metric. Number 2, we are a continent where our livelihoods are very close to nature. I accompanied Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Madam Zuma and the head of the World Bank to the Sahel last October. In that region, you could see clearly the link between development, security, and the environment. You cannot separate the 3. People in the Sahel are struggling with security issues now, but they're also struggling with the path of development over the last decades, which has meant that the environment is weakened. There's no way that can go on. Number 3, when I was a young student in the UK, I don't know, some of you are younger than me, I recall a British Prime Minister coming to television. In those days, they were black and white. We were students who couldn't afford color TV. And he was holding a microchip. And he was saying, this is what will destroy jobs in Britain. Now, the labor movement, the trade unions, and people working in factories were very worried at what IT was going to bring about in terms of job losses. And there was a fear of what then was called a small microchip. Now, we all know, nothing has created more jobs on this planet Earth than that same microchip, which is a source of huge fear at the time. I do believe, like many of you here, that actually this green path, other than being a way to preserve natural capital, will provide jobs for the future. That's where the jobs will be, provided we do it right, as we're trying to do at the African Development Bank. Now, I know there are fears, as there were fears then about microchip. The fears I've seen, at least in the bank, as we discuss these issues, is, okay, so Europeans have used their coal, Americans have used their coal, so are the Chinese. Does this mean that we shall not be able to develop our core resources? The answer is, we are free to use all the resources at our disposal, but use them in a way which preserves natural environment, and that can be done. There's no contradiction between using all your resources and doing it right to generate enough power which Africa requires. Now, as for the financing, Yvonne, here's the dilemma. Trevor and I sat in a commission set by Mr. Ban Ki-moon to finance this post-Copenhagen agenda. And there was a whole set of fantastic technical ideas on how to raise $100 billion a year. So the technical answers were there. I think the only issue, Trevor, please remind me, maybe we had assumed that the carbon price would be around $24, I think. Now the market has collapsed with something else. But already, by pricing fossil fuels properly, we could be able to raise enough money here. At least tax those fossil fuels for those who are using them in an intensive way. There are many other proposals put to Mr. Ban Ki-moon, but these proposals have not seen the light of day, not because they're not technically viable, but because they are politically difficult. So the answer is, we need to mobilize to ensure that those recommendations, which were made under the chairmanship of Meles Zenawi and the Prime Minister of Norway, are implemented, or at least some of them implemented. Because right now, even for adaptation, for the damage done in the past, we don't have enough resources for that. So I think the technical answers are well known. It is now the political will we must mobilize. And I want you to count on us in this exercise. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, President Kaberuka. Thank you. Thank you, President Kaberuka. So implementation. I'd like to pose a question to our institutional representatives from UNEP and the OECD. And the question is, how can we now address the institutional, technical, and technological obstacles that hamper the delivery of that finance for green growth? What are the entry points for action, Henri Bernard?
Maybe just allow me to add to the previous point on the financing. You know that in the OECD we are helping donors enhance the efficiency of aid and how it can support initiatives by African countries in particular. But I think the bulk of the resources cannot be provided by external sources. It has to be efficient domestic resource mobilization. And that's a topic that we looked at in depth together with our colleagues of the African Development Bank over the last few years. And it seems that there's a lot that could be done to mobilize those resources more effectively and actually give the means for governments themselves to drive an ambitious agenda. And it has to for instance, the number of fiscal resources that are not exploited on urban property. There's a number of economic actors who probably could contribute more, but benefit from sometimes not wisely decided exemptions. And there's probably the need for recalibrating a lot of the tax structures in African countries that would sort of raise new resources. As to how we can, in terms of institutions, prompt change, it's a very difficult thing. As I was saying in the beginning, it's about changing the mindset, it's about changing attitudes, about changing practices, and it means mainstreaming across departments in a government. That means getting people to work together and actually share new objectives. It takes a lot of time, it takes resources, it takes capacity. Our contribution through the Development Assistance Committee, for instance, has been to work with a number of African countries. Rwanda is one of them, actually, in our Enabling Green Growth agenda. And we've come up with a number, they've come up with a number of priorities which are targeting the infrastructure deficit, looking into better natural resource management, and also mitigating the impact of climate change. So when you think about it, and you were talking about the image problem of the green growth agenda, these are things that have to do with everyday life of economic actors and of citizens. So the issue, I think, is to go down to earth and realize that the agenda is not one of preserving the environment for the sake of it, but actually promoting a development that's good for humans, because the environment in this problematic is a means, not an end. The end should be to improve people's lives.
Thank you so much, Desta, and then VP Sector Operations.
Thank you very much. Just to start with a supplement to what President Kaberuka said about the energy mix, utilizing all the energy resource that we have. Most people think that UNEP is against coal industry, or what we are preaching is there has to be a sustainable mix of energy resource based on the endowment you have. And for Africa, Africa is the region with the largest renewable energy resource base. That has to be at the core of it, but around it you could have all of the resource to be developed depending on the country situation that you will have at each country level. Having said that, to the question you raised, when it comes to mobilizing resource, President Kaberuka mentioned about what has been proposed at the global level. At countries level, there are a number of distortionary, inequitable subsidies that are introduced by national governments already in place, which could be removed and directed towards more productive areas. For example, Ghana, by removing fuel subsidy that they have, which is benefiting the rich and the affording group, not the poor people, and directing that to education and health service, has managed to achieve something. At a national level, there are a number of measures to be taken. At regional and global level, we are working with different partners. I mean, with the African Development Bank, UNECA, under the leadership of the African Union, we have developed the African Green Economy Partnership, which is a regional partnership to be led by the African Union with the support of African Development Bank, UNEP, UNECA, and so on, to facilitate this process and provide to countries a more coordinated and coherent support on the transition to green economy, including finance, knowledge, technology, in a more integrated way. These are the mechanisms that we are trying to build in the region, in the African context. Globally, we have the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, again, which is bringing major global players, in which now more than 40 countries have joined as members. And this is also a process that is trying to support the transition to green economy at countries level, dealing with the issues of finance, knowledge, and technology again. The Global Green Growth Knowledge Platform that we have with OECD, World Bank, all these elements are coming into place. So the institutional mechanisms are coming up. What I plead to African countries is you have to seize this opportunity and be at the front of it in order to make use of all these mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dessa. Final point from VP for Sector Operations. What is the bank doing in terms of delivering efficient financing for green growth in Africa? What are the entry points for action for your institution? And then we're going to open up for questions from the floor.
Okay, allow me just to back up a second on the point that has just been discussed on the financing needs. It is important to recognize that dealing with impacts of climate change and helping countries transition to green economy will come with a cost. But it's also important to understand that there are a number of options available for countries to take that does not require significant amount of funding, but requires a significant understanding of what those areas are and the political will behind it to make those things happen. And in this regard, I always like to think of the Ethiopian experience. Ethiopia, when they developed their roadmap to transition to green economy, they looked at what is the base development scenario for them to reach a certain growth rates in 20 years' time. And of course, that included hydropower, because hydropower is in abundance in Ethiopia, but also other areas such as industrial development, the housing market, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And surprisingly, the greatest impact that will come from the emissions from all of these sectors came from the agriculture sector, not so much from the energy. And Ethiopia recognized that they needed to manage that sector simply by improving the management and handling of the livestock within the country could bring in significant dividends and would help position Ethiopia on the trajectory towards green development. Interestingly enough, one cow actually produces as much greenhouse gas emissions as a car would emit. Of course, very few people know that. Now, on the issue of what the bank is doing, our engagement with the country so far, we've worked with Mozambique to establish a roadmap for a transition to green development. President Kaberuka launched that roadmap with the President of Mozambique about a year ago. We're working with Sierra Leone to help mainstream the green growth thinking, starting from the PRSP and the CSP process, the country strategy planning, to identify what are the options and to also engage the population early enough in the stage so that they are part of the solution rather than part of the problem. In Rwanda, we're working with His Excellency on the costing of Rwanda's plan to transition to green economy, and many others, Kenya, Tanzania, and Liberia, and others. We have already in place a number of instruments, trust funds, that could provide some of the initial funding to handle the analytical upstream work. And of course, we do that in conjunction with UNEP, with partners from the WWF and many, World Bank, of course, and other colleagues working in these, other institutions working in these areas. But I would like to share with you the fact that using standard instruments available to the African Development Bank, we have invested $10 billion in funding low carbon and climate resilient projects for the period 2011 until 2015. Most of this money has been committed so far, and then the remaining part will be committed over the next few months until the end of 2015. So resources are available. What is critical for us is to identify what needs to happen, that the country engagement needs to happen at the very planning stage, and then for a partnership that brings institutions, that brings different parts of the solutions like OECD, UNEP, World Bank, ourselves, together to work with the countries, of course, on the leading front.
VP Sector Operations, thank you so much. Round of applause for the panelists. I think we've had some very useful and insightful feedback from them on this topic. I now want to open up for questions from the floor. So start to prepare your minds for anything you may want to put to our panelists. And before we go back to them with questions, or maybe it's a comment that you have or a perspective that you want to share from your own experience or your organizational experience, I want to turn to a youth perspective from Landry Ndiriko Mayengane, President of the Youth Alliance for Climate Action in Rwanda. I wonder whether there is a generational disconnect on this issue. Landry, if you could please stand up, and we need to get a microphone, please, to Landry. There's one coming just to your right-hand side. Please introduce yourself, Landry, and give us your perspective.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking the African Development Bank for granting the youth an opportunity to share their perspective on this very important topic, which is green growth. As the theme for this year's annual meetings says, the next 50 years, the Africa we want. So let me proceed by asking all of you here a question. How old will you be in 2064? The decisions we make today are not necessarily for us, but indeed for our children and our grandchildren, Africa's youth today and tomorrow. According to the African Economic Outlook, young people aged between 15 and 25 represent more than 60% of Africa's total population and account for 45% of the total labor force. It is expected that this increase in the number of young people will not decline in the next 20 years. The continent's demographic dividend is not a given, but if well prepared for, with all the right policies in place, it will indeed positively transform Africa in the decades to come. As a young person growing up in Rwanda, today, I see how important natural resources are for livelihood and the economy. But in moving forward, we are now at the crossroad of what choices we will need to make in order to advance the economy with the finite resources and growing population. Although the term green growth may sound unfamiliar to some, in reality, our day-to-day lives hinge on it. In simple terms, green growth is about growing our economies while also maintaining and developing our environmental and social capital on which they depend. Inclusive green growth, therefore, should be seen as a necessity for sustainable progress, but not as an alternative. Ladies and gentlemen, my call to action today is for the decision makers to empower youth to actively engage in this dialogue, to provide us with the skills and the education we need to harness the economic opportunities and to manage the environmental issues we will be facing as we look forward to the next 50 years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Quick reaction from the panelists. Youth engagement. Is enough being done to engage the youth? Trevor?
Obviously not. Can I just come back to something else? And
Sure.
I want to say to the Honorable Kamanzi that what the Rwandese people do, and it's very evident here in Kigali, in respect of maintaining this place as a clean environment, is exceedingly encouraging to all of us as Africans.
Yes,
and I think that one of the things that they have right, and perhaps it goes back to when a certain young man was still Minister of Finance here, is the pricing of plastics, because I think they also have a very high index of renewable plastics in this country. And so it says to me that even on the energy issues, you can actually price in the bad. And that's what's happening here. And that's why you have a clean environment. There's a price to be paid, and it's in managing that and in demonstrating leadership that you can get that right. And it's going to be about the transition, and Landry's right, it's about young people taking up responsibility and being able to communicate this so that it's not left to old fogies like us sitting on the panel, but young people recognizing that the future must be seized, that the paradigm must be shifted, that there's an opportunity for new initiatives. And so don't wait on us to talk to you. You know exactly what the issues are, so demonstrate that change will happen through you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. If there's no further response from the panel on youth, did you want to say something, Desta, before we go to...
I just want to comment on what our colleagues said. One of the key features of green economy is more about social innovation than technological innovation. Because the technological innovation we need to have for the transition are already here. They are on the shelf. What we lack is the social innovation. In that social innovation process, the key players are the youth, the young people. You should be the one who should be creative and innovative on how you mobilize your communities and use of those technologies. From UNEP perspective, we are supporting the African Youth Coalition for Green Economy, in which we are bringing young people from across Africa and engage in discussion. The whole purpose is to drive that innovation process. So I'm very glad with what you said, and you are the future. This is your agenda.
Absolutely. Okay, so it's time for some questions from the floor. Please, if you have a question for the panelists, or you have a comment or a perspective you want to share, I can see 2 hands at least up already. Please state your name, your organization, or who you are, and if you're posing the question to a specific panelist, please name that panelist. Gentleman with the blue shirt.
Hi there, Dion Nell from WWF. I just wanted to speak quickly to the concept of valuing natural capital, which was raised by the panel. I think there's a danger in thinking of natural capital or ecological systems in an additive way, that it's something that we need to add onto the economy. Being from South Africa, I'm often asked, so what's the value of water in South Africa? And my simple answer is, well, what's the value of the economy of South Africa? If the value of the economy of South Africa is $400 billion US dollars, then that's the value of water, because you can't do anything without water. So a project we've engaged in South Africa is looking at the water towers, and President Kaberuka spoke of the importance of water towers yesterday. And we've determined that 8% of the land surface delivers 50% of our water and supports 80% of our GDP. So a simple calculation is that 8% of land is worth, $320 billion US dollars. So my input is just that when we think of natural capital and valuing natural capital, that we need to think of it as ecosystems being foundational to social and economic systems. They're not additive to those systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gentleman behind you.
So my name is Frederick Kwame Kumar. I work with WWF as well. 20 years ago, when the UN began the Earth Summits, one of the things that the UN kept saying to all of us was that the world was moving towards living beyond its capacity to replenish itself. 20 years on today, we know that the world is living beyond its capacity by 1.5 times. Now, most of us here are bankers. We know you cannot spend what you don't have. So I think the beginning point is what Minister Manuel basically said. We do not have a choice. We need to move forward towards reversing this back to one planet, the Earth living within its means. And when you take the principle, then the question about whether Africa follows the West becomes something that doesn't actually have to come up. Because the fact that the West has gone one direction doesn't necessarily mean that we go the same direction. I have 2 kids, and one of the things my kids always do is to say, look, your sister has done this wrong, so I'm going to do the same thing wrong. And I always say to them, you do not have to follow bad practice. And I think as Africans, we can model good practice for the world. The last point I want to make is about our planning horizon. And I'm really excited that the Africa Development Bank is talking about the future of Africa. And I think until we have a 50-year planning horizon, we will not address this issue. Because short-term planning basically ignores long-term impact of what we do today. To be able to look at the future of our youth and our children, we need to be talking 50 years on. And so our planning cycles across the board needs to be looking at that. And we need to be looking beyond country-level planning. One planet doesn't require planning at a micro level, it requires planning across countries. And so I think regional economic communities are critical for us to transform the world and the continent's direction. So these are my inputs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Whilst you prepare yourself with more questions, I just want to bring in Dominic O'Neill. Dominic, I'd not forgotten you. I did introduce you at the beginning as the ED at the African Development Bank, representing the UK, Italy, and the Netherlands, and DFID from the UK, Department for International Development. Dominic, we're just getting a microphone to you.
Yes.
Green growth, your perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I'm speaking with 2 hats. I'm representing the UK as well as being an ED on the board. The UK was extremely happy that the ADB took a strong leadership position on green growth and that it features prominently in the 10-year strategy. And as you've heard, very strong leadership, as personal leadership from the President on this, which is very welcomed. The challenge is now going beyond the good intentions and the rhetoric and turning it into reality. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about what the UK through DFID has been doing in this regard. DFID's own activities all go through a program called Future Fit, which ensure that everything we do, policies, investments, all of our staff, all understand and act on the links between poverty, climate change, and sustainable economic development. Secondly, that we, in all of the assistance we provide, in our bilateral assistance, it all contributes towards building resilience, particularly in relation to food, water, and energy. And finally, that we will continue to seek out opportunities to innovate, build new partnerships with the private sector, and capitalising on the UK's research experience. In that regard, this very much matches what has come up as priorities from the panellists. We have 3 objectives on our research: to better evaluate and value natural assets, to support and develop the evidence base for green growth, and we do that in various ways, including our support to the Green Growth Initiative, and understanding how to crowd in potentially new sources of financing, in particular through the private sector, to respond to market failures in that regard. And the UK supports, for example, the Green Africa Power Fund and the results-based low-carbon energy access fund. So very practical ways of taking this forward. We appreciate there are concerns among people and governments about the potential trade-offs that we have to make, but we believe through evidence and through action that we can show that this is a win-win situation for everybody. Thank you.
Dominic, thank you. Round of applause for Dominic O'Neill, please. ED, UK, Italy, and Netherlands. Okay, so back to some, I can see some hands up at the back. If we can get microphones to those individuals, please. Please state your name. Oh, we've got also a question at the front here.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
My name is Geoffrey Tumwesije. I'm a student at the University of Rwanda. I'd like to ask you, the panelists, yeah, indeed, green growth is the future for Africa, but how are we going to achieve this? I'm pretty challenged. We see, if we look to to these countries that are modernized, the likes of Japan, US, and other countries that we know that are so developed. They're industrialized and they have lots of industries. But if we can look in this, are we going to really develop following the green growth, or it's going to be like green growth versus industrial growth? Because you can see, if we happen clear off setting up industries, clear off building infrastructures, then it's going to, the greens are going to get off, cease to exist. But then, what are we going to do? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take another question and then I'll put it to the panel. There's a lady at the front here, please. If we can get a microphone over to her. Any other question? We'll take one more. Okay, and the gentleman just behind her. Please go ahead, madam.
Yes, thank you so much. I thank the presenters. But I think just because I'm talking after this student, I think you have to understand green growth is not tree planting or cleaning the city. It is about development.
Madam, could you tell us your name, please?
Sorry. My name is Rose Mukankwemeje, and I'm Director General for Rwanda Environment Management Authority.
Excellent.
Under the Ministry of Natural Resources.
Thank you.
So I think this transition requires resources, and I'm glad the president of the bank has said resources are available. But I think the strong foundation requires mindset change. Because for us, this transition to green growth is about sustainability, and the president has said so. The big issue here is that this green growth we're talking about is coming in the context of climate change impact. How can we develop and at the same time live with climate change impact? Our people, specifically, because the question has been raised, are affected by climate change impact. Floods, landslides, even dry out. So what is happening? How can we, I would like to understand maybe from the panelists, how this issue of sustainability can fit with the green growth we're talking about. Because if in our mindset, this issue of green industrialized mistakes has been done, what is required is that Africa needs to develop, but I think we are no longer allowed to make the same mistakes as others have done. At the same time, some countries like ours, we have established fund for environment and climate change in order to support communities, youth, but still the resources to be availed for us people who are affected are not yet there. What is the bank is talking about grants, but how can we tackle money in order to develop, do very nice roads, at the same time avoid to see them destroyed by climate change impact? Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much. I've taken note of those questions. And then the gentleman just behind you, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Mulisa, and I coordinate the Fund for Environment and Climate Change in Rwanda. Happy to report that as Rwandans in our own simple way, we are reaching to the future actually, based on this fund, based on green growth, climate resilience strategies that are in place that this fund seeks to implement. One of the things I want to bring to the fore that has been talked about is why are we not moving as fast towards this, although it makes sense, particularly to the audience in here. I think it boils down to knowledge generation, knowledge management, creating evidence for where we want to be through green growth development pathway in 50 years. So it's about how do we bring evidence to bear to policymakers so that it can lead to implementation. And the last thing I want to talk about is financing, which is what has been talked about. How do we ensure financial flow? It's not about the scarcity of finances. It's about creating this evidence to make a case so that financial flows can go where they are most needed, the green growth we are talking about. What has been talked about even by the moderator is efficient financing. My question to the eminent panelists there is, how do we ensure that financing that is out there is actually efficient? In our own simple, we are talking about mobilizing resources and supporting projects which we are already doing to influence green growth. But the question is, there is still the question of efficient flow of finances, be it from domestic sources as well as external. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So just to recap, panelists, the gentleman from the University of Rwanda doesn't see how African countries like his own can become like Japan or the United States or the UK with a green growth agenda. Is it possible? The lady from the Rwanda Environment Management Authority, I think that's correct, was making a point about sustainability and how that fits in to the green growth agenda. And this gentleman from the Environment Fund, also based here, is asking why we're not moving faster. How do we bring evidence to bear to those who can actually bring about the changes? And he also had a point about efficient financing and how to ensure it. Please go ahead, whoever's poised to answer. Desta, go ahead.
Thank you, Yvonne. Let me start with our WWF colleagues. The point they made is very much valid. By the way, WWF is one of the partners also within the African Green Economy Partnership. And in one area where we expect WWF to take leadership is in the natural resource accounting, how to bring it into the natural development process. So we fully agree with that point. Geoffrey raised about green economy, green growth, industrialization. I'm a chemical engineer by profession. I know what is happening in the global industry context. One of the major areas of innovation that is happening across the world, including all developed countries, is greening the brown industry. And under the Global Partnership for Action on Green Economy, the green industry is one component which looks at, there are so many inefficient industries in developed countries. The green economy issue is not limited to Africa only. So transforming the global economy is a challenge that is being taken up by developed countries. Honorable Trevor Manuel earlier talked about China. China has come to this stage by utilizing its resource, creating a lot of pollution. Today, they have a council led by the president of the country on ecological civilization. And they are creating 5,000, 6,000 industries, eco-industries in one area, which are fully connected to one another with very low level of pollution impact to the environment. So industry is shifting also. What we are talking about is any sector of industry that we talk about, there is a new way of doing it in a more efficient way. That is what we need to pick up in the African context. Dr. Rose and Alex raised a very pertinent issue. In fact, Dr. Rose can answer the question she raised. Rwanda is an example in terms of how you can deal with the climate change impact issue, addressing the flood, landslide issue. There are a number of cases in rural Rwanda where she herself has led a program that helped communities to mitigate this process. Within the African context, we have examples that we can take and replicate in other countries, starting from Rwanda to other countries. The point you made about green growth is not about tree planting, city cleaning, and so on. That is the most important point. The green economy, green growth issue is about a new development path, a paradigm shift, as was mentioned by the Honorable Minister. Finally, Why are we not moving so fast? It is about development trajectory. Once you go into that trajectory, it will be very fast. But the inertia that we have within the built-in economic system is holding us a bit. But we have made a lot of progress. We are very much optimistic at UNEP with the progress we have seen from 2008 to today. So we are closely approaching that trajectory. Hopefully with China moving into that process, I think the world will follow. And that is where I think African countries need to join as fast as possible. Thank you very much.
Desta, thank you. I cannot give all the panelists as much time as I've just given you, because it's just been pointed out to me that we only have a couple of minutes left, and I still want to come back for some final thoughts. So please, just one response each to the questions, if you so wish. VP Sector Operations, go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, thank you. Very quickly, not in a particular order. I want to come back to the whole issue of financing. I want to underscore that the ODA is a very small fraction of the total budgets of the African countries. And the signs we have seen, the evidence we have seen over the recent years is that Africa is already taking charge of its own future. A lot of resource-rich countries are emerging, and a number of others, through policy, are improving the domestic resource mobilization and increasing the tax base and collection and better management of the energy sector. And I think the one good example, the recent example that I would like to cite is Angola, a resource-rich country with a relatively comfortable fiscal balance, is already taking a number of policy measures to improve regulation, because the level of ambition they have to develop the energy sector goes far beyond what they could finance as a state. So they want to put the appropriate policy and regulations in place to attract the private sector so that they're able to take this. But along that, they also have a white paper where they speak about an appropriate energy mix. So renewables could be probably the best response in some of the rural and remote areas. So policy can have a significant impact, and some of those policy measures will not necessarily require substantive costs at the beginning. The second point is on the resilience. I think how can we develop while being mindful of climate change? I think some of you may have attended the events we've had on the Sahel and the Horn of Africa programs. These are very two good examples about how we can respond to the impacts and challenges of climate change, but in a manner that seeks to develop rather than to respond to emergencies. Let me stop here in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
10 seconds.
Thank you, Trevor.
I'd just like to go back to what Rose said. You see, yes, you're right. Issues of the green economy are about a paradigm shift. But I think we should not knock the clean environment, because those kinds of measures involve very ordinary people, and it raises consciousness. And if we think that it's a top-down technological solution, we fail to understand the people-centeredness of this transformation, which is why I thought the Kigali experience is fundamentally important to me as an African from elsewhere. Thanks.
Great. I want one of you to answer the question from the student from the University of Rwanda on green growth versus industrial growth. Is it possible to ever be like Japan or the UK or the US? Please go ahead. And then final thoughts. Go ahead, please, Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I want to reassure our friend that green growth is not contradictory to industrialization. And Desta put it very well. It's all about rethinking industrialization, adapting to the current trends, to the current challenges, and keeping in mind that even those industrialized countries like Japan, like the Western countries, had come to a point where they're quite stuck, and they're revisiting the approach to industrialization, and they're bringing in new green technologies and so on and so forth. So there's nothing to be worried about. Actually, industrialization is part of the pillars of the development we're contemplating in Rwanda. But we need to do it the right way, a way that takes into account how best we can use resources, so that we not only deal with the present, but also think of the future generations. Industrialization that is energy efficient, as opposed to what has prevailed in the past. So definitely, those words should be like a snag to being bold, moving towards the green growth path. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Due to time, we have to wrap up. now, but I'm just going to pose one final question for each of our panelists in under 60 seconds. What is the most important thing that needs to be done, the one most important thing to you that needs to be done to transition these economies across the continent to green growth, starting on my left-hand side with Henri?
Thank you, Yvonne. I'll go back to my point of changing the mindset of the mind revolution that we need. How do we free the green genie out of the box? And I think one contribution that we can make is to use the influence that our organizations have in terms of framing the agenda. Because we do have potentially an immense influence. How can we account not just for the issues at the project level, but also in the way we picture the performance of economies altogether? Take account natural capital, assess performance and challenges for sustainable development, and also assess Africa's immense contribution to the global natural wealth. I think there's a big effort to be made. We, OECD, stand ready to work with our African Development Bank colleagues, with our UNDP colleagues and governments to mainstream that approach through the African Economic Outlook report so that we can contribute to that mind revolution.
Thank you so much, Henri. Minister Kamanzi, the single most important thing that needs to be done. In under 60 seconds, please.
Yeah. First of all, I would sum up whatever we've been reflecting about. The question here now was shown to be, is green economy essential? The question is, how do we make it happen? This is the point, and that's what the next step we need to shift to.
I need the answer, Minister. What's the answer to that? In 60 seconds. As decision makers, we have to own it, and then start. How do I put it? Start finding the building blocks as to how we go forward about it. Thank you. Ownership. Mr. Conte from the Office of the President, Sierra Leone.
For me, I think we have to now move beyond the rhetorics to action. It's one thing to say the youth have to be involved. What concrete steps are we taking in our countries to let that happen? It's fine to talk about financing and all the theories that have been advanced. The realities are always different. How do we ensure? Sierra Leone, for example, we have been asked, or we have agreed not to use all the mineral deposits in the Gola Forest. So we keep the billions of dollars there for what? Green growth. Where do we get the money from? What efforts are being taken by our partners in the West to provide the resources? Because this is not a cheap exercise. We need resources, we need technology, we need capacity. That needs to be built, and if we have to make it action-oriented and not just rhetorics.
And when you say action, one example of action taken, please, very briefly.
I like the step taken by Ecuador, I think it was Ecuador, where they said, we are prepared to reserve all of these forests and all that is under it, but please, in lieu of the billions we are giving away, give us some money. So I'm saying for Sierra Leone also, for us to be able to go for a green economy, we need resources. So in place of the billions we are putting aside for the Gola Forest and other reserves, which we cannot touch because of these considerations, let people put their money where their heart is, where their mouth is, so that we have the resources to be able to do what is needed to change our economies and push for this green growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Desta from UNDP.
Yeah, thank you.
UNEP, sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, for me, I think the one core element is innovation, innovation, innovation at every level. The challenge we are facing is of planetary scale, but we have the human ingenuity at each and every individual level. So we need to empower everybody to be innovative in their local context, to be creative in managing their resource and making use of the best of that resource to the benefit of communities. And we have seen it in hundreds of examples. Whenever you encourage people to be innovative and creative, they come up with solutions. The solutions are there, but we need to empower everybody, use women groups, all actors to be as innovative as possible in whatever we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Trevor Manuel. Under 60 seconds, please.
The first bridge we have to cross is what gets measured. And there are different parts to that that we need to be conscious of. The first of those is the cost is a consequence also of the technological shift. The technological shift is also related to what we do. If we think in the old paradigm, if we think in GDP terms, we're never going to be ready to move. We've got to get across the bridge, and it's a mindset change that we have to lead, and leadership is going to be important in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, VP Sector Operations, ADB.
30 seconds, but three things. One is mobilize will for action, political will for action. Number two, put in place the conducive environment for the private sector to be part of the solution. There is no option. Africa's future will have to depend largely on the private sector to be part of the solution. Number three, improve the natural resources management efficiency. The discussion that we've had on the blue economy, Minister Manuel is leading on this, and women in particular will have a very important role to play in this particular area. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Briefly to recap, mindset, ownership, rhetoric, from rhetoric to action, innovation, reassessing what gets measured, and mobilizing the political will, enhancing the involvement of the private sector. I want to thank all my panelists. I think it's been a really great session. Let me just remind you of who they all are. Monsieur Henry Bernard, Solignac Lecomte from the OECD, Desta Baratu from UNEP, Richard Conte, Chief of Staff, Office of the President, Sierra Leone, Mr. Sabah, ADB Sector Operations VP, Stanislas Kamanzi, Minister of Natural Resources, Rwanda, and Trevor Manuel, Minister in the Presidency for the National Planning Commission. Please, a round of applause for the panelists, and thank you everybody for your contributions. Thank you also to Dominic O'Neill in the audience and the gentleman who was speaking from the youth perspective, Landry Ndiko Migani. Have a lovely afternoon, and thank you.